Welcome everybody to Urban Strategy in the Present Tense. Today we are putting the spotlight on the 57 Blocks Project, strengthening communities, creating safer neighborhoods. This is a production of the Lindy Institute for Urban Innovation in conjunction with Drexel's Urban Strategy Master's Program. My name is Andrew Zitzer. I'm an associate professor of urban strategy and the program director at Drexel University. And today I'm joined by Reverend Gregory Holston, which we are so excited to have you here, Reverend.
Excited to be with you.
So Reverend Holston is a passionate advocate and community and faith leader in Philadelphia. Since 2020, he has worked as senior advisor on policy and advocacy for the District Attorney's Office of Philadelphia. Before that, he was the executive director of the community organization called POWER, which stands for Philadelphians Organized to Witness, Empower, and Rebuild. Bringing all this work together, Reverend Holston now leads the 57 Blocks Project, a citywide initiative in partnership with the city's data lab and the DA's office to reduce gun violence and foster safer communities in Philadelphia. The 57 Blocks Project took its name from an article in the Philadelphia Inquirer titled "Intersections of Injustice." The article identified blocks in the city where there were 10 or more shootings between 2015 and 2021. The analysis shows that the blocks are neighborhoods with higher poverty rates and lower life expectancies compared to other parts of the city. So we're here today to talk about the 57 Blocks Project, the Data Lab, and Reverend Holston's deeper work to strengthen communities, create safer neighborhoods in Philadelphia, and in his own words, to quote, build the beloved community that we seek in the 21st century. So today we'll begin with a conversation between me and Reverend Holston, and then we'll open the floor and reserve some time for questions from the audience. As we go, for everyone listening, please don't hesitate to share your comments and questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to them in due time. So Reverend Holston, welcome.
So glad to be with you, Andrew, and the Drexel community, talking about this very important subject.
Yes, indeed. Well, so briefly, those of us who don't know about it, can you tell us a little bit more about what the 57 Blocks Project is?
Well, you did a good explanation in your opening. I think the crux of this is to understand where the underlying roots of gun violence. So the 57 Block Project or 57 Block Coalition is about 70 organizations in the city of Philadelphia. Some are unions, some are churches, some are mosques, some are gun violence prevention organizations that are on the ground every day. Some are rec centers, some are schools. They're all involved in this issue in a very visceral level. And they've come together around the idea that these 57, actually now 89 such blocks, where there are 10 or more shootings since 2015, are deeply rooted in the understanding of what racism and structural racism has done to this city and done to this country. Because out of the original 57, 53 out of those 57 are in formerly redlined areas here in the city of Philadelphia. Areas that were marked for disinvestment. Areas that where if one Black person moved into that area, the entire area was marked as severely declining. Those racist structures that were put in place by our federal government in the 1930s and that by law stayed in place all the way through to the 1970s, and in some ways de facto stays in place today, are the underlying roots of much of the problems of the Black and brown community here in the city of Philadelphia, and specifically the creation of the causes of gun violence in the city. I said 53 out of 57 are in redlined areas of the original 57. Of the 89 total, 79 to 89 of them are in the originally redlined areas. So we're all implicated in this structural racism. When we see young Black people killing each other on the street, it's not just simply because they're young Black people when there's something fundamentally wrong with them. It's about the structures, the institutions, the systems that we put in place that have created the conditions of their life and created the conditions that have led to gun violence.
That's so powerful, Reverend. And, my own understanding of redlining is that it was a federal policy that denied home loans to people of color and poorer people. And that had a spiraling effect that was just a disinvestment from those neighborhoods that decreased the rates of home ownership, encouraged white flight out to the suburbs where people would get mortgages for more advantageous rates, leaving behind people who couldn't get the support that the government and the private market owed them, and that those effects of redlining continue to this day in public health, in public safety, and in all the many different areas that your coalition works on. And
Yes.
I wonder, yeah, I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you bring together so many organizations and so many partners around a theme as controversial as gun violence, where there is so much stereotyping around the community as the culture of the communities, the kind of idea of a culture of poverty, and some of these fairy tales that we've been taught about the way violence works in the city. How do you overcome that and convince people to come to the table?
Well, I found that most people are looking for something a little bit deeper and richer of a rationale for this continuance of gun violence. Now, the pandemic has caused an incredible spike in gun violence. We have had the four worst years of gun violence in the history of the city of Philadelphia. But nevertheless, over the last 50 years, we have averaged 362 homicides every year for 50 years. And I felt that people I still feel that people are looking for something that explains this kind of systemic problem that we're facing, and not just a simplification of stop and frisk, more law enforcement, more policing as a way to address it. And I believe that I found that. And I also believe there was still momentum coming out of what happened to George Floyd and that whole movement for change, the Black Lives Matter movement in this city, and the whole George Floyd situation, where there was a hunger for people to actually look at what systematic racism has really done and apply it to concrete issues and concrete things that are happening today. So putting this article together, and I want to give a shout out to the Inquirer and also to Rebecca Reinhardt, who did some work on this as a controller as well. Those seeds of that have led to this coalition. And there is a hunger by many people who finally want to come to grips with what racism has systematically done to our community and start to really make amends.
That's powerful. And I imagine that the forces of COVID and the way it has decimated our cities and our entire world and our nation, along with the murder of George Floyd and other police violence actions, have kind of brought people to a new awareness. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the organizing itself. Who were some of the early adopters that have been doing this work for decades? And how did you bring them in with some of the other partners like unions and people who we wouldn't normally think of as being excited about reducing gun violence? What is the organizing strategy you use, Reverend?
My work with power over the years, uh, and my work with another group organization called OIC of America, uh, were tools that I was able to use to bring some folk together that I've been in a relationship with. Um, Back in 2016, we had what was called the Poverty Summit and released a report about Black poverty in the city that brought some of those same players together. Further, there was a coalition of gun violence groups I began to work with in 2018. Every Murder is Real, Mothers in Charge, um, Frontline Dads, and other groups that we began to work with to really push City Council for more resources to community gun violence organizations. Uh, Also, my work with Black clergy in Philadelphia as the gun violence chair for our president, Reverend Robert Collier, who made this the number one issue for Black clergy. All those organizing tools and relationships, being able to come together and call people together around a similar issue, that we took a small group, about 12 or 13 of those groups, in the summer of 2022, brought them together and gave out this really complicated, clear presentation on on 57 blocks and on redlining and on things that we could do right away to address this, and a request for $100 million for gun violence prevention. And all those groups signed on right there and then because they knew we're building something, building a coalition over the years that is starting to make a real change in the city. And from there, over the last 18 to 20 months, we would just continue to build that coalition.
The two words that really stand out to me in your answer, Reverend, are coalition and relationships. It seems to me that that's what is needed to kind of rebuild a conversation around some things that people may have given up hope on. Not the groups that you work with. The groups that you work with have been working sometimes for decades on this issue. But in the general public, there's a fatigue, there's a fear, there's a kind of concern about gun violence, and a feeling, I would say, among some that we can't get beyond this. But I believe in relationship and what we said earlier about beloved community, we can start to address some of these root causes. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the 57 blocks or the 89 blocks project and coalition's approach to handling and reducing gun violence. I know it's a multi-pronged approach where it's not just about policing, it's not just about investment, but it's about many different things. So what are some of the elements?
Yeah, that's what those very powerful parts of your question there. In terms of coming together and building coalition, and also what are the specific strategies. And there's pieces of that that really need to have more conversation about. But I'm going to address really some of the things that we're doing. I think the number one thing we do first is simply educate. And I say this without, we have not taught about redlining in our schools. We have not taught it in college. We have not taught it even in grad schools. Many grad schools have never had this history. And it's not just, of course, just redlining. It was redlining. It was the GI Bill. It was urban renewal, which meant, and as James Baldwin said, really Negro removal. It was all of white flight. It was all of these things. It was the war on drugs, which John Erkelman, a White House aide at that time, chief of staff at that time, eventually called that not just a war on drugs, but really a war on Black people. All of these things have created the conditions in the inner city, as we call it. We don't even call it the city, we call it the inner city. That all created all these conditions. And people want to hear that story. So when I say to you, out of that story, disinvestment in and redlining, and I tell you about my aunt who could bake as well as anybody ever could ever bake, would put Sarah Lee to shame. That when I tell you she opened up a restaurant just below Girard Avenue in the late 1960s, and that restaurant was successful in the number of people that came there and wanted her food, but she could never get the capital necessary to really finance it. And that business failed because she could never get that capital. She did not own her home. She was renting because she could not get a mortgage.
Mm-hmm.
Hear me when I say that's a story about all of those patterns, but that's the story of one of my family members whose dream was crushed because of redlining, whose dream was crushed because of the systematic and structural racism. And that because that dream was crushed, she never really got over it, and suffered into alcoholism and spent the rest of her life struggling with alcoholism instead of living that dream. And then I go back in that same neighborhood that she had that same restaurant in, and now it's called Northern Liberties in Philadelphia. And I see young white entrepreneurs having great opportunity to build businesses there. There's a degree of sadness that I feel because of lack of opportunity. And, dreams deferred. dreams crushed. That's the story. That's the story. People, so what am I saying? How does we keep connecting all this together? What are we trying to do with all this? Is that if disinvestment was the reason for the my aunt not succeeding, then extra investment, reinvestment, more investment, greater investment in the same people that were disinvested in, that there are young Black entrepreneurs right now that even may have been doing some things that aren't right, but if they have a dream that they could believe to do something that was fair and just and build a business for themselves, if they had the investment, maybe they could be able to follow that dream that my aunt couldn't have. That's how we correct the problem. In the long run, if disinvestment caused the problem, then reinvestment, major investment can solve the problem.
I think what you say about our lack of education on this issue is so true. And it's also so painful because this is being deliberately obscured and deliberately hidden. The legacy of urban renewal, the legacy of racial housing covenants, the legacy of the racial wealth gap, the legacy of redlining. And I just wanted to shout out a couple of books and articles that folks could take a look at. I think of Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor's Race for Profit. I think of the book The Color of Law by Richard
Yes.
Rothstein. I think of the work that's been done in thinking about the Address book is another book that talks about how where you were born determines where your life chances go. And I want to encourage any students or just curious seekers in the audience to go out and pursue some of these titles, to study up on some of this history that Reverend Holston is talking about. But I also want
to, and let me say quickly,
yeah,
it's, yes, it is where you live, but it is government policy that created this condition. Therefore, it's government policy that can change it. And so people say, what can I do? What can I do? What can I do? Yes, let's create new policies and create a new country with those new policies. That's what we have to do.
So let's talk about some of the ideas that we have floating around for investment in the 57 Blocks Coalition and in the Power Organization and some of the coalitions that have been calling for a redistribution or a reevaluation of the way we use our resources in this city and beyond.
So we can do some things in the short run. And in the short run, they make a difference. $100 million dedicated to these particular areas, these blocks, pinpointed with 5 particular strategies. One of the strategies has been proven to work is called cure violence or credible messengers. They're individuals who have experiences close to those who are involved in gun violence and have now changed and transformed their lives, and now want to reach back and try to grab people who are in that situation now and move them out of gun violence. That strategy has worked all over the country: Chicago, New York City, Baltimore. It's worked and proven to work. It's actually being done here. We want to do more of it. We don't have enough people that we have invested in it. We need to invest more in it. But it's the kind of investment that we make in Black and brown people, because that's who you're going to be hiring, and structures, institutions, basically, that's going to be a Black institution being built called Credible Messengers that can really save lives and at the same time give hope and investment to those who need jobs. So that's just one. Another one would be trauma treatment. We understand that we've had a whole society because of the pandemic that has experienced major trauma. All of us are been traumatized by being isolated, by being in solitary, by not being able to come out of our homes, being fearful of our lives, fearful to even touch people, fearful for people to even breathe upon us. We've all suffered trauma. Now add that trauma on top of trauma around gun violence, around the 6 years old, the 7, 8-year-old, the 8-year-old who sees the gun violence on their block, who peeks out of their window and they see the patterns in the street, who sees the blood mark still on the door, who sees the neighbor who once was here, who's no longer here because they were shot last night, and ask yourself, how does that affect a child 6, 7, 8, 9 years old? 10 years later, when they're 16, 17, 18, 19, many of the people who have been the shooters are actually those who have been traumatized themselves. The public defender said 81% of the people that they represent for shooting somebody has experienced violence themselves.
Mhm.
Hurt people do hurt people. We can do some very strategic things around making sure a whole community is being able to get trauma treatment, access to trauma treatment. Make trauma treatment the course, not the exception. Make it available even in parties and in block parties and ways of communicating with folks so folk can just feel comfortable sharing their stories so they can get the healing that they need, and we can save lives just with that. We don't have enough trauma people right now in the city. Right now, if you're trying to get trauma treatment, you might have to wait 3 to 6 months to be able to get it. We need to make it more accessible and available to everybody who's been traumatized, particularly in these specific blocks. And let me give you one more quickly. We believe in restorative justice. We believe that communities that have suffered this kind of violence and this kind of incarceration. In 2016, Philadelphia was the most incarcerated city in this country, and probably percentage-wise was the most incarcerated city in the world. We have these levels of incarceration where people in the same community are dealing with incarceration and also dealing with gun violence, are coming back to communities where they've been shot at, and also dealing with the trauma of being in prisons. All of this is together at the same places. We need a way to restore those individuals back to the community in a way that they deal with the pain that they cause, but also a way of bringing them back in so they're accepted fully and there's not continual retaliation. Restorative justice is the model that is being used across this country to try to do that, because we're trying to heal families, heal communities, heal neighbors, heal the kid that you've known all your life that actually is the one that shot your cousin. How do we grip with that as one community? Restorative justice is the pattern that we use for that. And so those are three quick things that we do already, but we don't do enough of, and we're not doing in a coordinated way across the city, in a more expansive way across the city, to really address gun violence and other issues in our city.
Well, it sounds like $100 million is just the beginning to do all of that
Yes.
hard work.
Yes, yes, it is. And I tell people that it's not a long-term vision on this piece. This stuff is short-term and long-term, meaning if you do this now, it won't just affect the long term, it will affect immediately. Within a year, you'll see a change in the percentages. All the studies have shown that to be the case.
One thing that I saw on some of the research I was doing is that there's also an emphasis on the places themselves, green space, and revising and revitalizing the communities in the blocks themselves. Can you talk a little bit about how the physical landscape affects our emotional decision making and our cognition?
Certainly can, and we have 5 kind of basic solutions. I gave you 3 of them. That's the 4th one. The 5th one is workforce development. But let me talk about play space. You know, so I always tell this story of the young man, 15 years old, who shared this in one of actually the district attorney's meetings with young people. He's 15. He said, I come out my house, I'm paraphrasing, come out my house, there's glass, there's needles everywhere. The properties around me are running down. Uh, there's trash all over the street. Uh, there's no green, there's no parks for me to go to. Um, I go to my school. My school has peeling paint. Um, there's leaded pipes, so I can't drink from the water fountain. The building is also run down and fallen around me. He said, They don't care about us. So why don't we care? So I don't care about myself.
Mm.
He related how the place was around him to the impression that the community or us as a city really did not care about his life. And since we don't recognize that when we don't care about young people don't get mad at us. Young people start to not care about themselves.
Mm.
They reflect what we think about them. And so he said, I don't care about myself. And that happens constantly. But I will also tell you, we're a reflection of the places that we live. When we want to get away because we and feel better, what do? We go to the islands. We go to a place that's beautiful and we feel better about ourselves. When people want to get away on a retreat to be able to talk about issues of life and go deeper in those issues, they find some beautiful green acres somewhere where they receive wonderful food and a beautiful view, and they reflect upon life and they feel better about themselves. So the opposite definitely happens when you're in neighborhoods that are not beautiful, when you're in neighborhoods that are not reflective of the beauty that we all have inside. You also take that reflection into yourself and feel that about yourself. And that's what that young man was saying. And that's why place space is so important. We need to green areas. We need to have trash removal. We need to make sure trash is picked up every week, maybe twice a week, so the neighborhoods remain clean. Or we need to change the very nature of the communities. We need to have more trees in communities because trees keep places cool and they continue to have show beauty. We need to do the things in these places that make them more beautiful. And by making them more beautiful, we actually reduce gun violence as well.
So what we're really talking about is quality of life in the deepest sense, not just as a superficial attribute of a place, but really as a fundamental rethinking of the way places function and the way we relate to the places that we exist.
Yes, and we're talking about something also that we don't think about as much as a policy, as an aesthetic, I guess we call it. Just the idea of what beauty does for us and the need for everyone to have beauty in their life, and
Mm.
how beauty actually quiets our spirit, makes us more peaceful and more joyful when we're around it, and how that's important for our humanity of how we live. uh, and it actually reduces gun violence, you know. And so as all the studies have shown, Professor Eugenia South of University of Penn has done much studies on this, and it's simply true, but it also makes sense.
I wanted to ask you, Reverend, about the work across the city, because there's so many different kinds of blocks and so many different kinds of communities from North Philadelphia to West Philadelphia and Southwest Philadelphia to Germantown. Are the blocks that you're working with more similar to one another, or are there regional differences in the struggles that you have to tweak each approach for each different part of the city?
One of the things that we want to do, and so we're doing some work in some of these blocks, but not nearly as much as we want to. We're still trying to get the $100 million so we can do much more work. But what we want to do, and we recognize that Philadelphia is a city of neighborhoods. So there's some pillar things that we want to do in all neighborhoods, but we want some unique things for each neighborhood. So when I tell you about that we believe as pillars for 57 blocks, that it must be community led, uh, that it must be, and for this one, non-law enforcement, that it must be a public health approach, place-based approach, and also is definitely about racial justice. Those are the five pillars that we take to every neighborhood. We share in every neighborhood. We talk about in every neighborhood. It manifested in every neighborhood. But Kensington is definitely different than West Philly, South Philly, Southwest Philadelphia. And so we ask for leaders for those communities to come together around a round table for those blocks so that they can share what they think is necessary to make their blocks safer in a non-law enforcement kind of way. So I'll give you one example of a 5,000 block on Germantown that we talked with last year, uh, and still again looking for more resources so we can do more work with them. But one individual explained, who was the barber on that in that block, that he had worked youth programs for the last 20 years that were his programs, um, and worked or played football and basketball with young people in the block. And for years, these young people had gone directly from his youth leagues right over to Germantown High School to play basketball, football over there. That was always the vision. I leave here and I go to play at Germantown. Well, in 2013, they closed Germantown High School.
Mhm.
They closed it. And at the time, the federal government came in and said, we're telling you that if you close this high school, your gun violence in the neighborhood will go up. We're telling you that now. We believe that's the case. That barber said, I saw my young people that were so invigorated in sports and activities. Uh, when that dream of working and playing at Germantown High School was gone, they took those same energies to start to shoot one another to the
Mm.
point that they actually had a scoreboard online saying, I got three of your guys. You got two of mine. I'm going to get number fourth. Almost like it was still an athletic activity. And so what are we doing on that block? Well, if we had the resources, it is to reconnect those. And he tells us this all the time. He said, but if I had some more resources, I could still reach them. If I had some more resources, like we've talked about, I could still reach them. Help me get more resources, Reverend Holston, so I can get those young people and still save their lives. Um, that story has stuck with me because we have not got the resources for him yet.
Right.
Uh, but that's how it's specifically to that neighborhood by listening to the people in that neighborhood and doing what they ask you to do.
On the flip side of the ground up approach with the grassroots neighborhood led, there's also a data component where the city's data office is very invested and the DA's office is very invested in learning about patterns of crime, patterns of sentencing, patterns of recidivism, etc. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the way data is integrated into the fabric of the 57 Blocks project.
Thank you. So first of all, shout out to District Attorney Larry Crafton for the creation of the DA's data lab. There was not a data lab like this before in the DA's office, and most DA offices across the country do not have this. He said, we cannot change what we do not measure. Well, if we don't know the truth of how things really work, how can we come up with the right policies to make change in the community? And so this was a very important and innovation of the DA's office. What's made DA Larry Krasner different, progressive? I would say probably the data lab is one of the main features of what makes him different. So we take that data and my friend Dr. Orrin Gurr, who is co-facilitator of the 57 Block Coalition with me, um, we take data and we looked at all the 57 blocks. Um, and so what we found was a simple thing. Out of the now 89 blocks, 7% of Philadelphia's land mass is in those 89 blocks, plus a quarter-mile radius around each one. At 7% land mass, you'll have 38% of all the homicides from 2015 to now. So what does that tell you? That in a small amount of land mass, that if we change and transform, we can change and save many, many lives. That gun violence is not really a citywide problem.
Mm.
It is in sections of the city, the same cities that we've talked about before that have been redlined. And so we take that data and we also learn. We learn from it. We learned that 38% of those homicides, 38% of homicides, only 38% of them have ended in an arrest. So more than 6 out of 10 homicides in these areas there is never an arrest for. If if we learned anything from deterrence, the idea of never getting caught, the failure to get caught will never deter anybody. Meaning, you getting caught is what deters you. If I know 6 out of 10 times, more than 6 out of 10 times, I'm not going to get caught for this, then there's no sense of deterrence. So we learned that from the data. But and so we've also learned about the neighborhoods themselves. 22% of all dangerous buildings are in these 89 blocks. 22% of all dangerous. And what we mean by dangerous buildings, we mean buildings that aren't and that possibly will be collapsed, buildings that are abandoned, buildings that have been used for all kinds of things other than living in. And people are concerned about those buildings. And that 17% of lighting outages are in these areas. The calls for we need more lights, we need more lights, we need more lights. One of the place-based things I didn't say was simply more lights in the community actually saves lives. And the people are crying out for it because we have the data that shows that they're crying out for it. This should fit our policy. Then we should be using our dollars to build more lighting in these communities. And we're proud to say that this kind of analysis has been used by the city now to do a big 2-year lighting push to make sure that every neighborhood is lit. So how do we use data? We data to tell a story, data to tell truth about communities, truth about neighborhoods, and then we connect that data to real personal stories about how that data manifests itself in the lives of people. And by that, you change policy. Data plus stories, data plus personal stories, data plus personal stories equal policy change.
I think that observation that it requires both data and the personal stories to do the change is something that I speak to my students about all the time, because numbers on a graph can be very illuminating, but unless we facilitate understanding and empathy through storytelling, those numbers don't come alive. We need the numbers, but we also need our people's stories to help us make sense of experience and to really empathize and to build on that. So it sounds like the 57 Blocks Coalition is speaking to data in a rigorous way, but not neglecting the importance of your aunt's story or the story of the barber or some of the other ones that illuminate the human element.
Absolutely. And I want to say in reverse, if you have a personal story without data, you have a chance to make a very huge mistake in terms of policy. You could be making a policy based on the exception instead of the rule. You could be making a policy decision on your emotions instead of fact. And so many times in this path that we've been dealing with on 57 blocks, we've seen people share with us their impressions of what should happen. And we say that doesn't match up with the data, but they will tell us a personal story. They give an illustration of why they think this should happen, but it doesn't match up with the data. So on both sides, if you have data without story, you're not going to get policy. But if you have story without data, you could be making it the worst policy decision you ever made in your life. You know? And so it's important to have both that are connected together where the story is illustrative of the data. You don't create the story. You look at the data and then you see stories coming from the data and you highlight those.
Well, you've just spoken the language of a researcher so beautifully, and those of us who are involved in engaged research that's community driven really appreciate the marriage of data and story that you've just depicted. I want to ask one more question or two more questions, and then I want to turn it over to audience comments and questions that have come through. When you say this is a devil's advocate question, I'll just put that up first. When you say it's 7% of the landmass of Philadelphia that's experiencing 38% of the homicides, there's definitely an energy in the world and a perspective that would just say flood that 7% with law enforcement, do stop and frisk, do heavy policing, zero tolerance, National Guard, etc. And I wonder why we're talking about lighting and we're talking about greening and we're talking about housing and we're not talking about just get them off the streets. I wonder if you could speak to that.
Have you ever played as one pastor friend of mine just said last week, have you ever played whack-a-ball? You know, when you whack it, what happens? Something else comes up somewhere else.
Yeah.
When you do that, when you pinpoint in law enforcement, and you don't change the conditions in which create the violence in the first place, you put that police in that particular pinpoint. Guess what? It just pops up somewhere else because you haven't dealt with the underlying problem. See, law enforcement, when they do pinpoint, they'll simply go right outside the pinpoint area and continue to do what they're doing because you haven't changed the motivation or the conditions for them to do this in the first place. But when you flood with resources, you actually change people's lives. You actually pull people in a different direction. You actually give people hope who feel hopeless. Excuse me. And that's the difference. That's not whack-a-ball. That's changing lives. And so our resourced approach is much more richer, much better than any of these other approaches. Law enforcement has its place, and there's some folk, just quite frankly, that only law enforcement is going to have to deal with. They have made decisions of how they want to handle their life, and we need law enforcement to deal with those.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that they don't have a purpose, but I am saying many, many more, in fact, who are involved or at risk of being involved are simply doing it for the conditions that they're living in. And if we can change those conditions, even in these small ways, we give them greater hope for changing their own lives.
So it's about changing structures, changing environments, building hope, and increasing the broader horizon.
Yes, absolutely.
So we have a couple questions from the audience, and I want to raise those now. We've got one that says, Daniel Schwartz says, given the proliferation and availability of guns on our streets, does the 57 Blocks Coalition address education on responsible gun safety to prevent accidental injuries and or death? Or is that part of someone else's work?
One of the groups that works in 57 Blocks, Ceasefire PA, deals with all of the gun violence, gun legislation, and all of that kind of work. And we kind of work through them on that and how we should move. So we don't teach anything regard to guns. We have enough to transform the places and be able to transfer the lives of people than to work specifically around those gun issues and gun safety. It's not that I'm against any of it, but our coalition just doesn't do a focus on that.
Right. Well, your coalition members do the work that that individually they handle. Like you said, Ceasefire PA, and I know the Philadelphia Police also offer gun locks and buybacks and other tools that are more specific. The second question, go ahead.
Frontline dads that do the gun lock piece. Every Murder is Real that does the partners with the police around, gun back give backs, and so all that work does go on through those groups.
The next question comes from Ashley Pollard and says, how is the 57 Blocks Coalition planning to engage with the Parker administration? What opportunities does the coalition see with the partnership with our new mayoral administration?
We're excited about her coming on. We don't agree on everything, like particularly around stop and frisk, but we do agree with her view about community investment and the need for community investment and the need actually for community policing as well. And much of her work that she wants to do around affordable housing, we are in definite agreement with her on. We have not had the opportunity to share this vision with her in terms of all the details that we like to. We're looking forward to that opportunity to be able to do that with her and with her administration as everyone gets in place. Um, but we believe that we're right on the same page with many of the things that she's thinking about and look forward to the opportunity of working with.
Well, it's my great hope that it will be a fruitful and positive and generative relationship. Um, there's another question, which is, have you interacted with the Gun Violence Coordination Center that's funded by the Philadelphia Foundation and William Penn? And if so, what has that interaction been like? Have you come across that?
I think you're talking about the Coalition to Save Lives.
I'm not sure. It's from one of our
Yeah,
guests, but
yeah.
yeah.
Philadelphia Foundation and William Penn. Yeah, they sponsored that particular institute, the Coalition to Save Lives. We 57 Blocks is a member of the Coalition to Save Lives. Their focus is on intervention. They want to focus dollars on those who are involved directly in gun violence right now. Uh, and they don't take the broader approach of what we've been talking about much in this show around the long-term effects of redlining and how that has caused and created the conditions of gun violence. That's not really their focus. Their focus is on how do we get people out of it that are in it. So we support that narrow approach. We just keep telling people it's going to take much more resources and much more than that to deal with this in the long run. Because as soon as we said over and over, as soon as you pull one out, there's another one coming right down because the conditions of the neighborhood are creating people, young people right now who don't have a criminal record, young people right now who are just getting ready to pick up a gun and shoot. Then you're creating them all the time because of the conditions. And so if you only focus on intervention, you'll pull some out, but there will be one directly right behind.
There are a couple of questions, Reverend, about the greening of the city. And one of them is about the 10-year plan. This is from Mark Pomper about increasing tree cover substantially throughout the city. He asks, how can this be accelerated or should this be accelerated? And another question says, what organizations are currently engaging in the greening of spaces in the area of Philadelphia?
So yes, it should be accelerated. It should be accelerated because we want every neighborhood to be beautiful. And trees make neighborhoods more beautiful. For our Frontline Dads organization is very much involved in the tree and tree planting and in the greening and a lot of the play space issues that we're dealing with. Again, the Penn organization, the urban lab led by Dr. Eugenia South is very much involved in this as well, and a few of other organizations are involved as well. And as we do these blocks, we're going to be looking to be greening a lot of the work that we're going to do as well. So definitely, it's powerful. It needs to happen. We should be doing that. It is one of many things that should happen.
Is it possible, and this comes from Ashley Pollard, that greening and cleaning the blocks that we're talking about could encourage gentrification and a rise in property values? There's this green gentrification argument that sometimes comes up, and I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that.
I want to say I understand the logic of that, but gentrification is happening because of profit. Gentrification and redlining. Redlining is the grandfather of gentrification. The very phrase gentrification, hear the phrase, gentrification, gentrification, the making of the city for the gentry. The gentry is a word for the elite class. So in this country, that has meant white people. So the very phrase gentrification is making the city ready for white people. Um, and people don't do that just with greening. They all of a sudden turn on the investment spigot to allow developers, to allow private developers and public developers to create pockets of areas in which they'll pour investment to transform that neighborhood, not just with trees, but with new buildings, with tearing down previous structures, with pushing out people. It is the idea that you buy low, you sell high. If I buy low in these poor, impoverished neighborhoods, and put a minimal amount of investment in, I can sell high and make a whole lot of profit. Well, why was the neighborhood in the condition for you to buy low in the first place? Because of the redlining from the 1930s through the 1970s that created the conditions that never allowed those properties to be getting the value they should have in the first place. So gentrification is just again a child, a grandchild of redlining, and we have to change structures in the real estate industry so that people can make profit in a way that does not displace people, that allows everybody to be able to live in these neighborhoods. And again, so greening is part of it, but not the main part. It is the structures and the way we do real estate in this industry, in this country. Is that the key factor in terms of gentrification?
Yeah, it strikes me, Reverend, that talking about affordable housing, real affordable housing, talking about home ownership, talking about community land trusts and community ownership of lands are ways to transform the property market so that people can stay in place and they don't have to be moved out when the time comes for greening and cleaning and environmental amenities, but they get to stay and be in place. And I think that we have our work cut out to really transform the way we do our real estate infrastructure, as you said, to make sure that people benefit from the amenities that come, as opposed to in some gentrifying neighborhoods, the amenities come and then the people move out.
Yeah, this modern real estate industry is only 100 years old, and so we want to recognize it moves by profit. How does it make profit? By getting you to move. It doesn't make profit if I pass my house down to the next generation, to the next generation, to the next generation. We own it. You can't make any more money off it. But we want you to move. Move. If you move, you got to get a mortgage. If you move, you got to pay interest. If you move, you got to pay us some money. So we want people to move. So what do they do to get people to move? They use race. They use violence. They use the threat of violence. All of this is about getting you to move, and that's how they make profit. And so we have to take that profit initiative out of it so that they make profit in other ways. Maybe they make profit in how multiracial a community is. Maybe they make profit in how prosperous the community is for everybody. Maybe they make profit in other ways. But we incentivize getting people to move, and we use race oftentimes to do.
Reverend, there's so many amazing questions coming through. I'm reading them as we go, and we won't have time to answer the majority of them. And I apologize to all of our audience members with your beautiful questions. We could go on for hours, but we're starting to wrap up in our last 5 minutes. And I thought I would ask you a hard question before I ask you an easy question. The hard question
These are not hard. These are not hard questions.
These are hard questions. These are real questions, but one that I think is a conversation starter, let's say, comes from Geneva Butts, who asks, in regards to fundraising, are you working with the reparations movement? I know there are conversations in Philadelphia and hearings and studies being done to think about reparations, but I wonder if that is part of the conversation or the imagination behind trying to raise resources to transform our communities.
Of course, when you talk about redlining and all these conditions of race, I think reparations is a part of that conversation. Um, and I love the work of Councilwoman Gautier and Councilwoman Brooks. They're fans of theirs. They're fans of us. They support the 57 block movement. So we stand together. I don't know how specifically I'll be working with them on this. We haven't figured that out yet, but certainly very supportive. of them and what they're doing.
All right, I want to ask you one final question and then we'll wrap up. And the final question is about um, going back to before now and knowing that you've made a life of meaningful work as an urban strategist. That's the term we use in the urban strategy program. Can you just share with us any milestone moments in your career that have helped you become the person that you are today and the work that you do today? Any story that you want to share?
I can think of a lot of ones, but one that came to mind is my work at Power, particularly those faith leaders and our work at the Philadelphia airport. One of my proudest moments is recognizing that 7 year work that we put in before I became the executive director, just as a clergy person, just as the head of our jobs team. Those 4,000 workers and the relationships we developed over time with those unions, Unite Here and SEIU, um, still are some of the most powerful moments of my life. Getting up uh, at 4 o'clock in the morning to greet workers as they came on, marching with them in the snow, marching with them in the sun in 90-degree heat, marching with them in all kinds of days and winters, just to take them from some who are making as little as $2.50 an hour at our airport to now many of them are making 20, 25, even $30 an hour for the same jobs. Certainly for us is our most, for me, is the moment we declared victory and American Airlines finally shook our hands and said, we're going to give you all of what you deserve. Was one of the most proudest moments of my life. And every time I'm in that airport and I see those 4,000 workers, many of them who still remember those days in which we blocked the airport gates and went to jail and went and got arrested. Many of them who remember us singing and praying for them on the floor in the airport, uh, still cry out to us. And it cries out to us what is possible when community comes together, what is possible when faith leaders and community leaders and urban strategists and everybody stands together to make real change, that we can actually make that change together. It gives me hope for this coalition that we're addressing now. It gives me hope for young people who are stuck in the cycle of gun violence. It gives me hope for the impoverished neighborhoods that we're trying to address. It gives me hope for the racism that we're finally taking a long look at. It gives me hope for our city that we, as the new mayor says, that we can be really one Philadelphia. Because
Mm.
right, frankly, right now, we are two Philadelphias, one rich and white and one poor and black, and where we can bridge the gap together.
Well, Reverend, it's such a powerful testimony to a lifetime spent in service and in fellowship and coalition and relationship. And may we all be so bold to build these coalitions and relationships and to do this life's work and to offer ourselves to these greater causes. So I want to thank you so much for joining us on Urban Strategy in the present tense. It's been a wonderful conversation. I appreciate you.
Thank you so much for having me, and thankful for this new relationship that we're developing. Looking forward to working with Drexel and working with all of your urban strategists to develop plans together to make us one Philadelphia, one for all of us.
Absolutely. And for those who are listening, if you're interested in learning more about Drexel's Urban Strategy Master's Program, you can email me or visit our website. We have lots of information. The Lindy Institute for Urban Innovation is sponsoring 4 scholarships this year that will cut the cost about in half to join this master's program. And so there's a lot of exciting things that we're doing in the spirit of what Reverend Holston is talking about in terms of systems change. I have been your host. My name is Andrew Zitzer. I want to thank our producer, Tom Devaney, and our production director, Hazel DeKito, for putting on such a wonderful webinar. And I want to thank all of you for your attendance. We'll send out a follow-up email with some of those resources we mentioned at the beginning, and we'll link to the Data Lab and to the DA's office and the 57 Blocks Coalition. And we wish you, Reverend Holston, all the best, and you'll go from strength to strength. Thank you all.